What's happening, folks? Welcome to Your Forest. I'm Matthew Christoph, and today I brought on Liza Piper. Liza Piper is an environmental historian with the University of Alberta. She has got her fingers in a little bit of everything. I was on her website trying to understand where all the connections are in all of her work, but she's jumping around from like disease, pandemics and stuff like that throughout history in Canada, also resource extraction within Canada, and ties that in with climate change and a bunch of different stuff. So she came heavily recommended through Rick Arthur. You guys might remember him from the Mountain podcast I released a few months back. And it was really great to have her in to talk about environmental history. And we ended up talking a lot about, right now she's doing a lot about coal mining, and how that's changed over time. Because, you know what I mean? Oh, whatever. We'll get into it. It's coal mining and talking about environmental impacts of that, talking about like oil and gas a little bit, and also like multiple use values. So talking about how everyone starts to feel connected to the environment and how there's an increase in societal values when it comes to environmental integrity and sustainability, right? So we talked a lot about a bunch of different stuff. We kind of jumped around, but it was an interesting conversation. I had fun, and I think I'll ask her to come on again sometime because she has a lot to say, and I think I think we could benefit from talking to her again for sure. As far as sponsors are concerned, same ones. What do you know? Same three sponsors. Green Lake Forestry, thank you. Forest Resource Improvement Association of Alberta, thank you very much. And also Damaged Timber. Damaged Timber is an apparel company here out of Edmonton trying to give back to the environmental sciences community through the sale of their clothing. So you buy something from them, 10% of that will go into a bursary or scholarship for environmental sciences students. They have hats, toques, hoodies. They're getting new designs out right away, all kinds of cool stuff. And if you buy stuff from them, you put in Your Forest 10 at checkout, you get 10% off, and 10% of what you paid will go directly to the scholarship. So, yeah, it's all good. May as well. We're all wearing clothes. May as well support something we believe in, right? No, it was an awesome conversation. I really wasn't sure where we were going to go with it just because she had so much going on. And I really liked where we ended up. Just talking about environmental integrity and kind of societal values around that. It was good. I really enjoyed it. I think you guys will as well. So, without any further messing around, here is Liza and me. Yeah. Podcast time. Now it's recording.
Okay. Awesome.
I first got onto you through, I was saying Rick and Sonia, right? Like they came... I think Sonia mentioned your name, and she was like, "Oh yeah." Rick's like, "Yeah, definitely get her on. She's got lots to say." So you're an environmental historian. So I guess we should talk. Like, what is that? What does that mean?
Sure. So, environmental history looks at the relations between humans and the rest of nature in the past.
Okay.
So that's a really broad kind of scope. So my work as an environmental historian, I look specifically at Canada. So Canadian environmental history, but even there, and I focused on things like resources, disease, climate. But again, you can see it is a really broad scope.
I would say those three things in themselves are like you could put a whole career into each one of those, right? So So are you still trying to find like your niche, you think, or you think you're just you're interested in all those things? You just want to keep going with all of them?
Well, part of it is so I teach environmental history at the University of Alberta.
Yeah.
So
what classes do you teach?
I teach a third-year Canadian environmental history course, and that goes from, I think in the course description, it goes from the end of the last ice age up to the present, basically.
Okay, so a really short amount of time.
Yeah. And part of what I emphasize there is teaching students to think about, to recognize that a lot of the things that we grapple with in the present, we've also grappled with in the past.
It's a repeating cycle.
So that's part of it. So in that sense, that keeps me broad. Teaching keeps me broad because each year the interests that students bring to it are different.
Yeah.
And a lot of the students in the class are doing the the BA in environmental studies. And so they sort of keep me contemporary as well, as opposed to just in the past too. But that my interests are, my interests have evolved over time.
As they always do, right?
Yeah. So,
I couldn't have told you I was going to be where I am today 5 years ago, let alone like before that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, my interest in resource history actually stems from, my parents are both geologists.
Okay.
So I grew up doing field work with them.
Nice.
Actually, that mischaracterizes it. Being dragged around the woods of Nova Scotia, basically. So a lot of my interests in resource history come from that. And that's also something that a lot of students at the University of Alberta are very interested in for perhaps obvious reasons.
Yeah.
They have a lot of connections to resource industries. Debates around fossil fuels are very prominent.
Yeah, no kidding.
so that sort of feeds that. My other interests have also evolved over time. And they're more oriented around northern Canada as well. So
like the territories in the Yukon and stuff, or you mean just like the islands and stuff in the north?
No, mostly the territories. So I've got one project that's looking at histories of disease in the Yukon and the Mackenzie River region.
Right.
And that's been really interesting because people often don't think of disease as part of nature necessarily.
That's what I was going to say. I was like, how does that tie in? But I guess, it's a natural, it is a part of it. Yeah.
Disease pathogens are organisms. And so that's part of it, but also diseases, how they played out in the north, is very closely connected to other kinds of environmental change. So putting in new transportation routes, the rise of mining, that all influence the shape of disease. So that's how it starts to get interconnected. And I think as a historian too, you tend to go down a lot of rabbit holes because you start researching something and that puts you onto something else and that puts you onto something else. And then it becomes, some of those things become big research areas and others sort of are smaller. And so that's sort of those are the two areas where I focus a lot of my research work these days. So.
Yeah. And so and you did a lot, you said, on getting into like climate change. And so were you trying to, like, I noticed you were talking a lot about the coal industry in the past or post World War II. Excuse me. And you're trying to tie that into climate change and how that's all been kind of related. Is that the idea there?
Yeah. So climate change is sort of, it's obvious, it's hard to, we can't escape it right now.
I think even Trump admitted it the other day.
I think he did admit. I noticed that too. I was like, okay, well, that's a positive.
Yeah, I guess so.
Won't necessarily change what he does about anything.
Yeah.
But, and when I first got into history, actually, one of the things I was interested in was the potential to know more about past climate change using historical sources.
That's the best way to kind of prove what's going on now is because of us and not just a natural cycle, is to understand. So yeah, it makes perfect sense.
What's happened in the past. And it's also looking at climate change in the past, I also thought was a really interesting way to think about how communities, people, economies respond to climate change.
Oh, okay.
So I did one, there's work that's been done, for instance, on the year without a summer in 1816. And that seems really old, right? Because that was so 200 years ago. But you see how people adapt, and also how some things break down in communities, how when harvests failed, that created social conflict. And
so what was that about? I never even heard of the 1816 year without a summer.
So that was
the gist. Yeah.
So that was there was a massive volcanic eruption in Indonesia, the Tambora volcano, which produced like this massive ash cloud
Gotcha.
And so the volcano happened in 1815 and killed tens of thousands of people at the site of the eruption, and then shot this ash cloud into the atmosphere. It traveled around the world and over Western Europe and Eastern North America, disrupted weather patterns such that the growing season was really short. And so people called it at the time the year without a summer.
Right.
There were bread riots in Western Europe, and then,
And that's before that's way before we had, fertilizer and stuff too. So it's like, you're totally dependent on nature's bounty. There was no amplifying it through like technological means. So,
exactly. Yeah.
So it's basically a nuclear winter situation, but from a volcano.
Yeah.
So it just shades out everything and doesn't let enough sunlight through for things to grow. Right. That's
the
idea.
Okay. And so, obviously we aren't in the early 19th century farming communities anymore.
Yeah.
So, but humans, there are continuities in human behavior. So that was sort of where my interest in some of the historical climate came from. But more, when you start coming into more recent history, and the coal mining work in particular, part of what I was interested there was just to see what the scale of coal mining in Alberta had been over time, to understand that part of our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, right?
Okay.
Because we do tend to focus a lot on oil and gas and the oil sands, I knew that coal mining had been significant in the past in Alberta. This was where the research started. I was like, well, it's been significant in the past. And, I'm also a bit of I like to count things, which is an unusual thing for historians. A lot of historians are less quantitative, like they don't count things as much.
Right.
I like being able to count things.
Makes it nice for like proving things to people, right? You're like, look, I can show you the numbers. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. And it actually, in the context of history, it often opens up things that you hadn't really appreciated before.
Right.
Whenever I've done quantitative work, it's always sort of shown me things that I wouldn't have found otherwise in the historical record necessarily. So I started counting along with she was then my PhD student, Heather Green. She's since finished her PhD. So
nice.
So we just started looking at historical production in
counting what exactly?
Just production from coal. Just simple production.
Okay.
Literally, like how much coal was being produced.
Okay. Could you get? Were you able to tie that into emissions somehow?
So then what you do is you look. You know sort of generally the composition of the coal. What ratio of them are higher grade coals and what ratio are lower grade coals.
Okay.
So it's not a perfect. I did have some sort of precise analyses of the coals from. Broken down actually by region within the province from the 1940s, and they're not going to change over time that much. So I was able to use that to then estimate emissions from it.
Okay.
But I think that the thing that became really striking from that wasn't so much the contribution to emissions, because in a sense we recognize that coal, no worries. Coal produces significant emissions, like with the, although certainly for me, so the really striking thing was how much coal had continued to be produced in Alberta, because that was not being talked about.
Okay.
Everybody, whenever people, you'd read about the coal industry and people recognize that it persisted, but unless people were actually living in coal communities or part of the industry, the general narrative that is out there was that coal became obsolete with the Leduc discoveries in 1947 and the oil discoveries of the post-war period. And so there's this sort of sense that coal went down and oil went up, right?
Right.
And that's reinforced in the history of coal mining, because in that immediate post-war period, that's when a lot of the coal mining communities, died, basically.
Oh, okay.
So in the coal branch, which is between here and Hinton.
Just like it's like a seam of coal.
No, it's the name of the community. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
So the coal branch communities were because the early coal industry in Alberta, so before the Second World War, was all oriented around the railways.
Okay.
The coal mines provided the fuel for the railways. So it was integral to economic development in the West.
Yep.
And so the main coal mines were, so like Drumheller and Lethbridge and the Crow's Nest Pass are all along the southern routes of the railway. And then there were, the coal branch ones were Edson, Coalspur, Robb,
Gotcha.
those places along the northern branch going through the Yellowhead.
Right.
At the same time as oil is discovered, the railways are converted to diesel. And so there's no longer that demand for...
So those towns died out.
So those towns, and in the case of the coal branch towns, they actually kicked the folks out of the communities and bulldozed where the communities had formerly been. So it was
Very
like
nice
a really sort of it was like a very abrupt,
Ending,
jarring ending to some of those towns. But then what happens? So you have like the demise of coal, which is sort of how everyone understands it and sort of makes sense. We live in an age of oil and hydro. But then if you start counting production, you actually see that coal, after that sort of period of the doldrums, takes off again in the 60s and 70s. And to the extent that, by 1996, about 5 or 6 times as much coal was being produced than had been produced at any point in the early part of the 20th century.
Was that relative to population increase, or was it probably
relative to, that's
hard to answer?
Hard to answer, because I don't, there would have been more coal being produced. The growth in the coal production would be more than how much the population had grown.
So it would have been more. Okay.
Yeah. What was the shift that happened is by the 60s and 70s, 2 new markets open up. Mm-hmm. One is the export market for high grade coal, which is what you get in the foothills and the mountains.
Okay. What's that used for?
So that's used for steel making.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it was exported, but in the 1960s and 70s, they start signing contracts with steel producers in Japan and South Korea.
Gotcha.
And so that restarts some of these coal mines. And then also at this point in time, the province decides to use coal-fired electricity.
Right.
So the other half is thermal coal. That's mostly from the plains, and that's going into the power plants.
Right.
And that's actually a really interesting sort of decision that's made by the Alberta government, because this is also when natural gas is being discovered in large quantities, and there's lots of oil. And so they build, for instance, one electricity plant just west of Edmonton around Wabamun.
Okay.
And originally it was supposed to be a natural gas electricity plant.
Yep.
But within 2 years, they switched it. They back to a coal-fired power plant. And that's because you could get more money by exporting natural gas. The goal is...
Natural gas is so cheap right now, too. So it's like, yeah.
So they export natural gas, export oil, and use coal for domestic power production for that period from up until the NDP government sort of said
so
we're
just
gonna...
2015.
Yeah.
Thing. Wow. Okay. So
yeah.
So how much? Do you know how much of the electricity in Alberta was created through coal fire?
Almost all of it.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's very little sort of other sources of power production in the province. Yeah.
Okay, and that's still happening today, but it's being phased out. Quotation marks.
Yeah. And so, exactly. That is, but so that part of it's being so about the thermal coal, and that's where you're getting sort of concerns in coal communities like Hanna and Forestburg about, because they still exist around these sort of this coal production. Mm-hmm. But the coal mining in the mountains and foothills, the demand for that is still really strong because that's for steel making. And even as we say, okay, we can substitute other kinds of power production, renewables, hydro, there aren't other way, steel remains this necessity, right?
Yeah, totally, yeah.
So that demand that will, there's no indication
that's steady.
That's going to go anywhere.
Yeah.
And the other sort of thing that really then also became interesting about that shift in the 60s and 70s is that it's all strip mining after the 1960s. Basically, it's very little underground mining.
Right. Strip mining being like surface. Yeah.
Surface mines. Yeah. And that's interesting because it has very different environmental impacts.
You'd think so. Anyways, we'll have a big hole in the ground versus a hole under the ground. It's yeah.
And very different. That's why employment in the industry shrank dramatically because, in place of 100 coal miners with considerable expertise at extracting coal underground, you need, 20 heavy equipment operators who are working on coal seams above, to extract above ground. So the industry's transformed, in the second half of the 20th century, and there hasn't been sort of historical research done on it,
right?
But also it continues like that new form of it is what we have in the present right now. So there's all these sort of present day implications to it as well.
So what are some of those implications from that increase in coal production kind of behind the scenes that we didn't really recognize until recently?
So one of them has to do with surface mining and the kinds of damage that it does.
Environmental damage.
And so when they first started strip mining for coal it actually starts around, it really takes off in the immediate sort of 1945 to 1950 period because there was all this heavy equipment that was produced during the Second World War. That when the war ends, that it's now up for sale. And so there's sort of diggers and that kind of thing that come on the market. And so that sort of helps to encourage this transition to surface mining. And so that they increased surface mining in the 50s, even as some of those coal mines are closing. The ones that aren't closing are moving to surface operations because they're cheaper. And people start getting upset. People in the coal communities down in the Crow's Nest Pass, people who go to the mountains for recreation. So there's a lot of public outcry about damage from surface mines. And so in the early 1970s, they hold public hearings on the impact of surface mining on the environment. And they have industry representatives, labor representatives, all the sort of different wilderness organizations are involved. Like everybody comes and sort of talks about it. And from that, they decide that what they're going to do is they're going to emphasize reclamation as being this is how we're going to deal with surface mining. And that reclamation policy is then what shapes reclamation, not just in the mountains and foothills, but also up in the oil sands as well, because that's basically surface mining too. So that's so as a historian, to me, it's really interesting because, this regulatory framework is put in place in the 1970s around sort of that historical context and the voices that were being heard. So that's one of the things. I've been going to the provincial archives here in Edmonton and digging through all the papers around those hearings, and then the kinds of policy changes, like, what did this mean for decision making on the ground and stuff. And so one of the questions, and one of the sort of current things is how much land has been reclaimed. Like, what is that reclamation?
I've been trying to find somebody to speak to, like, because we always hear that word, right? We always hear like, oh yeah, they're doing reclamation. And we're like, what does that mean exactly? Like, you know what? I know what it's supposed to mean. It's supposed to mean putting it back to the way it was, putting it back to nature or whatever. But the truth of the matter is, when you have a giant hole in the ground where there used to be like a hill, you know what I mean? So it's inverted. Like, how much can you really do? And like, most of that substance is gone. It's not like you could just like fill it in again because there's not enough. So like, I mean, you look at what I have seen done is it is pretty promising considering the options, right? Like they do change the landscape, but it's also, they are trying to put it back to something that can be utilized. So it's definitely a weird one. And I want to try and get somebody on to talk about reclamation, because that's a whole thing in itself. Like, how do you justify completely changing a landscape for this resource? But I don't know. There's so many questions around it. It's wild.
Yeah. And, it's really interesting to look at some of these reclaimed landscapes too. So, and this is how I got connected with the Mountain Legacy Project folks, because of the possibilities for doing sort of repeat photography to see, to look at some of those changes. Like, I counted how much coal was produced. So how much, what does that mean in terms of changes on the land? Like,
right. So they had a bunch of photos then. The Mountain Legacy Project had photos of the actual mines or nearby.
So there's photos from surveyors who went through before the mines went in. And so there's that pre-context from the early 20th century. Yeah. And some of them actually have some of the original underground coal mining communities, because a lot of the current surface operations are actually mining out areas where the older communities used to be. So,
gotcha. So the change is drastic, I'm sure.
Yeah. And, and one of the, we were, and so then we can go in and take photos right now. And it's actually quite, hard doing the repeat photography, because to really narrow down the spot where the photo was taken from, you line up the things that you see in the, in the background, in the distance, in the midground, in the foreground. And a lot of that's just not there. It's completely transformed. So then lining it up is a real challenge, but also speaks to the sort of the scale of the change.
Yeah, no kidding. Like the fact that I remember, I was ripping around in the helicopter with Rick and Sonia for a day there, and they were doing just that, kind of doing, because most of the places where those photos were taken were after a burn, so they're just sitting on bare ground on the top of a mountain taking a photo, right? And then, but now it's all grown up. It's 100 years later or whatever, so you have to hover above it with a helicopter, and they're like, hey, turn 5 degrees, and the helicopter is kind of shifting back and forth, and they're trying to, that's that and that's that. But even with everything intact, like there's a lake there, and there's other, even with everything intact, it was still difficult. So yeah, as soon as you start removing whole mountains, it's like, oh, that's, like, I don't know where. Yeah, so I could imagine the difficulty in that for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and and actually even on the ground, like, so this past summer I went to Mountain Park, which was one of these old coal branch communities, and now all that's left is the cemetery from the community, because when they bulldozed the community, they agreed to protect the cemetery for obvious reasons. And it remains sort of, I think, the highest altitude cemetery in Canada, actually. And it's and so around that cemetery, there's also a lot of the history of the community as well. Like, they've got plaques up that talk about it, and on one of the plaques, it talks about how a sort of regular community event was to run up the mountain just behind the cemetery, and they say, so look behind you and you'll see, and I can't remember the name of the mountain offhand, but that's where we used to have like our regular sort of summer event, and you turn around and look and you don't see it. All you see is a big pile of sort of coal mine waste, right? And so that again really just sort of drives home the extent to which something that was there has been completely changed.
That's a big one. I mean, for like, it's like that idea of like shifting baselines, right? Like every generation that's born thinks that when they were young, that's the natural world, that's the way it should be, that's the number of animals I should see, that's the amount of X, Y, and Z environmental pieces that I should see, right? And then as they get older, it's like, you know what I mean? It shrinks and becomes smaller, and there's less animals, and then their children are born, and then they think, well, that's natural, right? So like, it's, I think every generation we're losing more than we think we're losing, right? It's like there's like a cultural amnesia. Like, we forget what it was supposed to be like. So when you have photos like the Mountain Legacy Project that show, look, that was a mountain, now it's not. What do you think that has to do with like environmental integrity and habitat and all kinds of different stuff? Or like, who knows what was lost there that we weren't paying attention to, right? And it's not to say that we didn't need coal. We did, to keep people alive and for a million reasons. But now it's important to,
Yeah, I think it's, it's partly it's about recognizing the consequences of the choices that we make, you know, because we do make these choices around coal and around all sorts of other minerals. Like our lives are shot through. I still actually have on my fridge a who needs mining fridge magnet.
Yeah.
And it's just, you know, and it sort of, it dates from my childhood. So it reminds you that like the zinc on old rotary dial phones, like the little thing. Anyways, that was sort of from coal mining, or not from coal mining, from mining as well. So, but, you know, we do make these choices. And so to me, it's about recognizing and seeing the consequences of the choices that we're making.
For sure. It's not like with some people go through and they see the pipeline protesters like running out of gas on the side of the highway and asking for fuel, right? You're like, it's not like these people aren't saying that we should like stop using all of these resources immediately. They're just saying we should be cognizant of the consequences of our actions and where this might lead us in the end, right? Like, I think a lot of people that are like, they're very strictly for more mineral extraction or more resource extraction. They're just kind of thinking like economy and like, you're so stupid. Like, you drive around, you use plastic stuff and all this kind of, and it's very simple thought. It's like, it's like, that's not what these people are saying. Like, they recognize that they need oil to drive their vehicle and coal to power their home or whatever. What we're saying is we have the technology and the means by which to do better now, right? So why would we not do that, right? So it's an interesting like societal problem that we have, is that I think realistically people are coming from more of the same place than they think they are. It's just there's a missed bridge there, connection, whatever. They're not speaking correctly about their thoughts. They're just kind of everyone's just kind of shouting. Everyone's getting emotional, right?
Yeah, it gets really polarized. Yeah. And the thing I've noticed, you know, doing Canadian environmental history especially, is that a lot of folks in Canada, especially folks who aren't from the biggest cities, are about like 3 degrees separated from resource industries, right? Like,
totally.
Everyone, you know, someone's parent was in, you know, a mining industry or the forestry or fisheries or something. So in Canada especially, and I think that sets Canada apart from other countries in a lot of ways, that you do have, you know, resource industries are a part of everyone's
super rich in resources, Canada. We got a little bit of everything, right?
Yeah.
So,
and so it means that, to me, that means that we should be able to have sort of more informed and less polarized discussions about what this means because, you know, folks who like in the mining industry or in any resource industry, the way that communities collapse when resource markets are lost, for instance, like that's a big part of like a lot of people's life experiences in Canada. And so, you know, from that sense, you know, that argument from economy and jobs is really meaningful too. So, but, you know, you were talking too about shifting baselines and sort of seeing the sort of, I think that with the Mountain Legacy Project, that's also really invaluable because being able to see, to look at the landscapes around us and recognize them as partially industrialized landscapes and not just like wilderness landscapes. And so I do try to not just sort of study that to better understand, like when I'm looking at this place, like what that I'm looking at is you know, was there before, what has been changed. And with reclamation, it's interesting too, because there's like multiple generations of reclamation and there's different standards. And so they leave a different imprint on the land. So seeing those kinds of differences is really interesting. Like around the Cardinal River operations, which are south of Hinton, on the one side of the highway, you have the mine operation, and then the other side's been reclaimed. And so that other side is and there's no hunting permitted because it's prohibited there. And so there's tons of bighorn sheep and moose that just love that landscape. And so I see more, you know, I've seen more animals driving through there than, you know, it's like a big sort of grassland salad for them.
Well, they like coming up from those coal mines, a lot of times it's like clovers and like really rich, nutrient rich growth coming back that they go to town on, right? Like, there's a reason that the biggest bighorn sheep in the world come out of Cadman mines, right? Because I don't know what it is, there's lots of minerals there, and exactly, there's no hunting, so you can't shoot them, so that's another thing. But so, you know, but then to recognize that is a landscape with a history, right? Because I think, you know, if you
if
that's not a natural, quote unquote, natural landscape, right?
Yeah.
Like that was reclaimed. So
yeah. So to sort of to learn how to see myself, but also then to teach students also how to see. Like we took last spring. I've been trying to take students to do field trips into the mountains for the past, I guess, almost 10 years now. We don't do it every year because it's a lot of work. But we've taken them down to Banff a bunch of times and then up to Jasper, and taking them right into the parks is also really important because Parks Canada, they're just great in terms of being sort of the educational work that they do. And for students, people who grow up going to the parks, you sort of, you don't realize that all the stuff that happens that has happened in the past and that goes on sort of behind the scenes. And so part of what we do with these field trips is to try to we meet with lots of different folks from Parks Canada, and they talk about fire history and, the challenges of protecting these areas. And then we also meet with Indigenous communities to talk about their experiences of, being removed from park areas.
Yeah, because a lot of them were straight up kicked out of the national parks, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, when we would do the trip down to Banff, for instance, we would stop in Morley first and meet with the Stoney Nakoda, because in some ways it's also instructive because you do that first before you get to you enter the park, right? So it's this sort of very strong reminder of the fact that they were removed from the park. And then likewise, we met with folks from the Assiniboine Nation before we went into Jasper, and a lot of them were evicted from Jasper in 1910. To hear about their sort of ongoing relations with these places and how that history.
There's so much history there. Like there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, and in Jasper too, there's the Moberly homesteads, which were Métis homestead sites as well, and they were kicked out too. And there's still something again, using like historical photos, not the survey photographs that the MLP folks use, the Mountain Legacy folks use, but the just sort of photos of what this was like before it was the park that we know. And
the changes are drastic. Like if you go on the Mountain Legacy Project website and look at some of the comparison photos, it's insane, right? Like you have this patchy, complex, mountainous sites with lots of grasslands and some trees and rocky areas and all kinds of different stuff. And then you look at it now and it's just like, it's all covered in trees, right? And you're like, that's very homogeneous. It doesn't allow for a lot of diversity. And you realize like today people go to the park, they're like, look at how untouched this is and how perfectly pristine. And you're like, but that's not what nature was. Like that happened because like we stopped anything from happening. We stopped all the fire. We stopped everything. Right. And I think it's a weird one for people to try and understand, right? Because they immediately think that if we just leave things alone and keep the fire out of there, like it'll go back to normal. And you're like, no, you'll completely screw it up. Like it's hard. So that's a weird one. Yeah. So like it's interesting from your perspective, for your research and stuff, with the coal mining and how that plays a role too, right? It's there's a lot going on there. Yeah,
and it's hard I sometimes find it challenging with the students too, because you feel like you're being a bit of really negative. You're taking these students to these places and saying, this isn't natural. This is, this is a highly managed in some ways landscape and there's all these and students resist that too, because so much they've been trained to see these as like places of wilderness and
thanks Disney.
And and this past spring when we did it, we were really fortunate because Tech Coal took us on a tour of their the Cardinal River operations before we went into the park as well, and that was interesting too, because not only are those operations over top of some of the older coal mine operations, but also in the 1990s, there was a lot of protest around some of those proposals to mine so close to Jasper National Park.
Right.
And so, it is sort of a interesting to see. It actually really drives home, notwithstanding how parks are not sort of necessary, like they're not natural places, it does drive home the importance of protected areas because, you know, on the one side you have, you know, like industry happening, and then on the other you don't, and you have this protected space. And so it does show you why we need protected spaces. And you know, that sort of contrast is
I know, that's the weird thing, right? It's like, it's not like we have a point, we're just saying this is what's going on. It's like, so what are you saying? I don't know, just be aware of it, right? Like, no, for sure, it's not that we're saying that protected spaces shouldn't exist. It's like there are unique habitats that need to be protected in one way or the other. But yeah, it's like, it's good for people to understand that, you know what I mean? Like, we've been on the landscape. We've always been on the landscape. Like, as you know, the indigenous people have been here and they interacted with nature and used fire and did all kinds of different things. But like, when we started becoming more prevalent on the landscape and doing more and more and more, I think, we kind of lost sight of environmental integrity and sustainability for a little while there, and kind of we're just focused on like economy will fix everything, right? And you're like, so it's interesting to see as a society. I think we're kind of slowing that down a bit and trying to find that balance again of environmental integrity and economic prosperity, right? It's a weird balance. It's a very strange line to toe, right? Because I mean, it's a fine one, and you do need economic prosperity to be able to give a shit about the environment. You know what I mean? 'Cause you can't feed yourself. You're not going to care about what the environment is doing, right? Yeah. So like, you do need both. But it's super interesting in this day and age to see so many people care about the environment, but then also they care in an uneducated way. They're just like, well, everything that we do out there is bad. And you're like, well, that's also like, it's very, like I said, I don't really have a point. I'm just kind of talking here, right? But yeah, I think it's important work to try and get those points across, for sure.
It's being a historian. It's always a challenge because a lot of what you do is just make things more complicated.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
And because you know, and that there aren't easy, but you know, that's, I think, one of the things that is key to, you know, any sort of engagement, like in policy making, recognizing that these are not things with simple solutions. They're complicated, and so you can't just assume that you're going to have like a quick and easy fix, and you know, like that's going to solve all our problems. So that's like a big part of you know, what in. And also try not to make things too complicated.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, right? Like, I read something the other day. I can't remember if it was an article or what it was, but they're talking about like climate change deniers, right? And they're saying they did like research on this, and like the best way, like if you walk in and you have all these stats and you just throw everything at them, they're more likely to just ignore it all and stand their ground because you just confuse the hell out of them. They don't know what you're talking about. Whereas if you just try to pick one part of it that they can follow and try to see how that toes into their life and how they can understand it. So like 2 or 3 good arguments is better than a million like half thought out arguments, right? So it's like, but yeah, it's I don't know. I don't even know what I'm saying.
No, and I think that that's also why, like, to me, environmental history is also a really good way to go around, because it's kind of counterintuitive, because it's like, I'm really concerned about the present and the future, right? And environmental issues, and but I study the past. Like, and so, you know, why is that? You know, how on earth, because those are the things that have come and gone, you know, and the concern is in the future, and so part of it is about finding those stories that very sort of in a very straightforward fashion kind of convey why things are important and what is important, and how can we sort of try and make sense of these complex issues, and what decisions were really key in the past around regulation and environmental protection. You know, and why were they? Like, why did those decisions matter? Like, why did reclamation work as sort of a decision? Where others, where other ideas or proposals didn't work, and
well, it's important. I mean, it's important to know where you came from to understand, to not make the same mistake again in the future, right? Like, that's the thing that historians always say, right? Like, if you don't know what we've done, how do you know what's going to work or not work, right? Because like, you see those like mistakes all the time. They just like the same mistakes are made over history again and again and again and again and again. And yeah, if those people only read a book, maybe we wouldn't be having this problem. But yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, but it is hard to convince people, like, why should I give a shit? Like, it was history. Like, it's like, I'm worried about what's happening. Like, I want to change the world. I want to blah, blah, blah. Everyone wants to have their impact on the world and be a visionary or whatever. But a lot of them, I think, go about it without understanding, you know what I mean? Like, it's a half thought out idea, not quite all the way there. And you can't, and history can help you get there.
Yeah. Well, and even like, cause, you know, now the environmental like our present day environmental movement really dates from the 60s and 70s. So it alone has a 40 plus year history, right?
Yeah.
50-year history. So even in there, you can see, like, you know, what strategies worked, what strategies failed, and why, you know, what was like, what kind of, and so, you know, some of what environmental historians do is look at that history of activism and its successes and failures and that kind of thing. So, you know, I think that does, and what's interesting for Alberta actually is that people often assume that Alberta didn't have that, like that you know, Alberta didn't have that history of environmental activism,
right?
Which, you know, and the problem with that is that it lends itself to this notion that it lends itself to these narratives that there is one way in Alberta, and that's the sort of like,
gotta get that oil.
Yeah. And it's like, no.
You put your foot down hard in Alberta and oil comes shooting now. Put it in a bucket, let's go.
Yeah. So, and it's like, no, actually, like, it's been contested in the past as well, and recognizing that there were people on both sides of the issue for 40, 50 years. Like, well,
yeah, even people don't realize that, like, we had a conservative government for whatever 44 years or something like that, but people don't realize that before that it was basically the NDP. It was a socialist government for like 60 years or something ridiculous, right? So like, yeah, so people seem to think that we've always been like a very conservative, true to our roots type province, but that it's constantly changing politically. I mean, you know, people just trying to back and forth, trying to find the right balance, right? But yeah, no, I think you're probably right. I don't think most people realize that we had that history. Yeah, and it was under the public hearings on the environmental impacts of surface mining were under like the Lougheed government, right? Yeah, and they were the ones that sort of introduced that legislation. So. You know, thinking that's also an important sort of part of it too. So. Well, for sure, and even just environmental sciences as a science, like as a means of research, is relatively new. Like, when really can we say was the birth of environmental sciences? Like, I mean, it's hard to pinpoint it, but you know what I mean. Like, it's a new area. Like, the University of Alberta only had a forestry program for, what was it, like 20 years or something like that, or 30 years before it got like a land reclamation and biosciences or whatever. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it was just forestry for a long time, and then they got the extra ones, right? So that in and of itself, I think, as a society, is like relatively new as well. So it makes sense that people have a hard time grasping those ideas and trying to make sense of them, right? Because there's so much misinformation out there too. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, like, environmental activism. So what was going on in the 60s then? That was like, so yeah, you said there was lots going on then. So there was, well, part of it was these sort of, like, I've looked at it a little bit in the context of concern about the surface mining, but there was more, like, there was more happening in Alberta than just that. There was in Edmonton, there was a group called STOP, Save Tomorrow, Oppose Pollution, right? That would do sort of a lot of like local. So one of the at the time in the late 60s, early 70s, one of the big concerns was about phosphates, especially in detergents, because that had been shown in Ontario, especially, to be contributing to the eutrophication of like Lake Erie, which turned the lake green, and everyone was bemoaning like the death of Lake Erie, and it turned out a lot of it was phosphates and other sort of organic pollutants that were coming from sort of agriculture around the lake, but also from laundry detergents had phosphates in it. So
there's this story about how Stop would go in grocery stores and would like make a big fuss about people buying phosphates.
That doesn't help.
In their,
yeah, so
in their
someone's just trying to like wash their clothes, and you're like, "You're evil." You're like, "That's not solving the problem, guys."
So
right idea, but totally wrong execution.
Yeah. So there was, and then the other thing that's sort of interesting that we often forget about is that in the 70s there was a lot of opposition across Canada to the pipeline, to the Mackenzie Valley pipeline, and that's really interesting because of present day debates. Like pipelines have evoked debate in a way that, to me, sometimes seems almost disproportionate to their impact, because like we move these, if we do move these resources around in lots of other ways. And so it's, I guess it's not so much disproportionate as it's really interesting why pipelines, like why have pipelines like prompted debate in a way that, railroads and, the activities themselves haven't.
It's a weird, I think it's just it represents like corporate evil in a lot of people's mind, right? Like the greedy corporation trying to like drain the government and wring it out of the environment, right? But it's like, that's not what this is.
But where did that idea, and because that's sort of one of the things that that's interesting to look at, is like, where did that idea come from? Where is it that representation came from?
Well, especially considering that pipelines are my understanding is they're the best way, like the most environmentally like integral way to get oil across, because like they're way more likely to have a train flip over or trucks, or like the number of times that a pipelines fail is like, you know what I mean, relative to the environmental damage. It's like, my understanding is that the pipelines are the safest way to get it to where it needs to go, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know where that came from. It's like, you tell me.
Well, I think the only thing that I would hazard a guess at from looking at the way in which the Mackenzie Valley pipeline prompted concern in southern Canada, right? And so from doing Northern history as well, like, it is interesting to me that for lots of the 20th century, no one cares about the North. People in the South don't really think much about the North. And then at this moment in the 70s, they do all of a sudden. And so part of it, I think, is the way that pipelines are, serve in the imagination to connect these distant places. And so the debate, and you see that a little bit, with the Energy East pipeline and the Trans Mountain or the westward pipelines, that it's all of a sudden the politics that are sort of simmering in one region are linked up with the politics like elsewhere down the line. And so, the Mackenzie Valley pipeline, it was about taking oil from the north and bringing it into the south, right? So all of a sudden it connected, Southerners had a connection to northern politics, and that sort of their imagined space kind of like extended.
Right.
And
there's a place up there where there's stuff.
And
and it's Canada.
Exactly. And then they start learning a bit about it, and it's like, oh yeah, like I feel strongly about some of these issues. And so they feel like they have a stake in it in a way that, railroads, they don't, because even though like we don't actually debate putting down rail lines anymore, and the trains sort of move through space. I don't know. I actually find transportation infrastructure really interesting, whether it's like pipelines or railroads. So I think, and I think it organizes our understanding of the world in really important ways. And so I do think that is part of what happens with pipelines, and what helps to elevate them into areas of, and you see that actually in the case of the ones going west, is that it gives provinces start to have debates about things, about their respective resource policies, when normally those debates are all conducted within a province, right? Like usually we don't have to listen to other provinces' opinions about Alberta's, fossil fuel.
We govern us, you govern you.
And that's sort of an interesting artifact of like resources being governed by the provinces, that we don't have national discussions about them. And so I think that's sort of a lot of what's at work there.
It's an interesting one. Like that happens all the time with environmental issues, I find, right? Is that there's a lot of people are very opinionated about what's going on, but not a lot of them can tell you why, right? Like you could say like, well, I really feel strongly that like, I don't know, wolves should be protected at all costs, right? And it's like, but that person thinks that like wolves are endangered or something, right? And it's like, well, they're actually putting like a lot of pressure on like all the ungulate populations and they're whatever, right? They're killing all the caribou, which are actually endangered or whatever, right? Like there's so much nuance to it, but people really like to feel like they're like, yeah, I'm on the right side on this one, right? Like I'm on the right side of history. And it's like that multiple use value, right? Like the person that lives in downtown Edmonton or wherever, Vancouver or something like that has a strong feeling of like, I don't know how you word it, but about what's going on in nature, right? And they want to know that we're doing the right thing, it's protected. And as soon as they hear about a corporation, any corporation that wants a piece of that pie, it's immediately against them. And you're like, we have to remember that those are also just people that are also trying to get jobs, and they're trying to like, they probably go hiking and hunting and fishing and whatever. So like, it's not like this evil entity is trying to take over the world and like, you know what I mean? But it's, yeah, those multiple use values in that sense, people that are disconnected, but yet connected to those resources. Yeah. I don't know. It's a fascinating problem that I think it'll stand the test of time for sure.
Yeah. Well, and the wolves one, you know, it's funny that you mentioned that because, there was one of in my environmental history course, one of the things that I teach about is when Farley Mowat published Never Cry Wolf, and the way that it generated public, like across Canada, concern about the Canadian Wildlife Service's policy towards wolves.
Right.
And it was really interesting because you know, part of what made that happen the way that it did was that Mowat was such an effective communicator. Like he made the wolves, you know, he gave them personality. He sort of turned them into like his family and
personify them a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. And so all of a sudden, all these folks who'd like never seen a wolf and had no sort of sense of
it's a puppy dog.
Yeah. It's like it's Uncle Albert and, you know, like, and so they get really invested in it because of the power of these stories that have been told about them. Right. And then, but on the other side, all these, so there's a historian who's sort of worked on this. She looked into, there was a lot of letters that got written into the Canadian Wildlife Service about, you know, Mowat's book and stuff like that. But then all the people working in the government department at that time were like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
Like he has no, you know, and the critiques of Mowat, and it's sort of that sort of, so it's a really good example of that sort of the way in which people can get sort of fired up around a particular issue, you know, in that case, because of the power of one person's sort of ability to communicate their concerns, however, you know, loosely tied to the reality of the situation they might have been. But then that does have an impact on sort of decision making going forward, because the government, especially the government, has to be more responsive to all this sort of concern and feedback and whatnot. So.
Oh no, for sure. Yeah, it's just one of those things where like, and all that concern is coming from the right place. You know what I mean? Like we want people to pay attention. We want people to be informed and to care and to have an opinion, but also you want that opinion to be based on something and not just the ramblings of some random, right? You know what I mean? Like, and it's like, and you're like, and wolves are a good representation of that because they are super majestic and like mysterious. Like, I mean, I spent a lot of time in the bush and I've only ever seen like 5 wolves in my entire life. And it's like, they are an incredible creature, but to pretend like they need our help in Alberta is just like, it's just not. But like tying that into resources and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. It's a weird one to try to talk to people that have those opinions, right? That are just off they're coming from a good place and you want them to care, but they're missing the mark because of where they're coming from is from misinformation or whatever, right? Or a personified book or whatever it is. And like trying to change their mind or convince them that what they've been basing their argument on is wrong. I don't know how you I don't know how you bring them onto your side with like the scientific side of things without getting them emotional about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, you're like, I know you care. I understand you want what's right. How do I show you that you're wrong and how to be more right? Right? Like, and not even that's just an opinion, like how to be more right. But yeah, it's one of those weird things where like there's so much, I think, environmental. I don't know if I call it activism, but like environmental consciousness today that I think is awesome. And I don't know, but I just don't know how you get them to get involved in a way that they're not just taking what PETA says or what Greenpeace says and running with it. Because like, you know what I mean? They all have their bias. So yeah, it's a weird one. I don't know. It's
funny because, I grew up in Nova Scotia, and so, and I remember Greenpeace was never like a good thing.
No, it still isn't.
Because growing up out east, it was always about the seal hunt, right? And, if you out there, there was sort of the narrative that I grew up around was that because of Greenpeace, they'd stop the seal hunt. Because there weren't as many seals, that had the burgeoning seal populations had further undermined the fish populations, which is what then led to the collapse of the fisheries. Yeah. I know now that that's sort of, not really how it happened.
It's easy to tie 1 and 2 together, but that's how it worked. But like, prove yourself. What?
But the sort of the how alive those politics, were and are in some respects, like around, the seal issue sort of remains alive today. It's really, it's really interesting, and I often think, it's you're not. I've stopped trying to change people's mind about things. Like I usually just sort of, if people are interested, I just hope that they would sort of learn more about the one, because that's the thing. Also, you realize, like, as you start studying something, like there's so much to learn about any number of topics. Like I know, there's so much I have to learn about reclamation, for instance, and like the science of reclamation and
the science of like pottery would be like a whole. If you wanted to be the best potter of all time, like it would be a lifetime commitment, right? So when you get into something like environmental studies, it's like
and it becomes so hard because everything is interconnected, like the world is everything hangs off of everything else in the world, and so it is, especially in environmental studies of any sort, like that then becomes the problem. Like you almost have to sort of say, I'm not going to look at these implications, even though I know that they exist, or these connections, because I'm just going to try to focus on this one.
You have to have focus.
Yeah.
No, for
set
sure.
of problems. So, but yeah, I think that, if you, and also getting people to talk, like when we do the field trips, part of what we're doing is seeing places. Like part of what it is about taking students into these places and having them actually see like the change over time for themselves, whether with the fire, like the changing fire policy. But it's also because we're meeting and we're talking with these different people. And it's much harder to have a very strong opinion about something when you're actually talking to somebody who is, invested in that other, way of doing things. And so I think that that's very important for the students, because a lot of the students, they go on to jobs in government or jobs in the private sector, but in environmental sort of, this is going to be part of what they do going forwards. And it's and the thing that's nice sometimes about the history is that history can kind of be neutral territory at times, because, well, I should be careful about like interpretations of history are like, are heavily debated, right? But for instance, one thing that can be really sort of helpful and a way in to talk to people is to show a picture from, some of those old survey photographs, you know, and then people start talking and telling you their sort of understanding of that place in the past. And that's just sort of it creates opportunities for sort of conversation that to me are what are better able to help us sort of sort some of these seemingly intractable problems out than otherwise. So,
No, it makes sense. Like I wouldn't say I try to change people's minds either anymore. I think what I've gotten onto recently is like trying to stay unemotional when talking with people, right? Like just trying to, because I think that's like when it comes to these types of issues that are so polarizing, it ends up being just like, two emotions yelling at each other from across the room, and neither one is listening. They're just yelling at each other, right? And it's like, it's trying to get them just like, all right, let's cool our jets. And like let's actually have a discussion around like why we disagree. If we can get to some like middle ground somewhere. And I think more often than not, you find that you're coming from a similar place, just slightly different perspective, right? And it's but it is good to see that more people are getting involved in this kind of stuff and are interested, right? Because I think it shows that we'll have a more like sustainable future in that sense, right? Just a more, I guess, cognizant future, right? Like we'll be more aware of how everything is impacted, right? Because I think I had a good podcast, I think, with what did I call it? It was about like integrated land management, basically, right? So like managing the whole landscape as opposed to individual aspects of that landscape, right? And like that seems to be the way we're going, right? So like you were saying, how everything's interconnected and everything affects everything, right? So like we need to be looking at the big picture and trying to and pulling strings a little bit here and there instead of making these big crazy rash decisions to, we're going to stop pumping oil right now. I'd be like, yeah, and a lot, like half the population's going to die or whatever, right? Like, so but it is really good to see that people are, getting involved and actually have opinions about this kind of stuff for sure. Yeah. No, it's huge. Well, that's an hour. So I don't know how much more we want to do with this, but I always ask everyone like a final thought, like if you could summarize, if you had something you wanted to say to the public or to whatever, or to, it's a lot of resource professionals listening to this. So if you had something that you thought was interesting or wanted to promote or whatever, yeah, just kind of final thoughts.
I guess, just that I think it's really important that we remember that these landscapes and resource industries, that they have a history that isn't just what happened in the past, but does continue to shape present relationships, present patterns of development, all this kind of stuff. That those sort of threads are connected through time, and for getting people to sort of look at places and see that industrial history, I think is actually and resource history it's a really interesting thing, because you can, it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to always be like a declensionist narrative, like a story of destruction and degradation. Like it can also be a story of like learning and understanding, and it is always a history of history is change over time, so it's always changing.
Exactly.
But I think that is part of what really informs and is what I think is important to why we look at the past, is to sort of help ground these things in what's come before, and how that is continuing to influence what we do sort of in the present. So
no, that makes total sense. Yeah, I think it's that's it.
You're a convert.
No, let's drop the mic. That's the end of that. If anybody wanted to reach out to you or anything, or they can always shoot me an email at yourforestpodcast@gmail.com. But if you wanted to, had like a way for them to reach out to you, then
they can reach me at through my email and contact information's on the university website, but it's liza.piper@ualberta.ca.
Yeah.
And I'm always happy to talk more about these things.
And you can probably help people with like graduate studies and that kind of stuff if they want to get into that, right?
Yeah. Or of course, there's a lot of courses at the U of A that if folks are interested in learning more, then that they can be directed towards. So, yeah.
Sweet. Awesome. Thanks a lot for coming on. This is good.
Yeah, thank you.
I didn't know where we were going to go with this today. I was like, man, there's so many topics like climate change and everything, but it turned out perfect.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, good. I'm glad to know that.
Thanks a lot for listening, guys. If you guys have any questions for Lisa or myself, yourforestpodcast@gmail.com, or you can go to lizapiper.com, I believe, lizapiper.com, or maybe it's .ca. I'm not sure. One of those two. And we'll answer your questions, get back to you right away. Don't forget to rate and review. Helps me out a lot, gets it up in the iTunes rankings, more people find it, and we can build this community. Sound good? Awesome. Thanks, folks.